Hey guys, my name is Tensor. In today's tutorial, we're going to be building a simple chat application using Phoenix LiveView. Phoenix LiveView is a relatively new technology. It was actually just released to the public a few weeks ago. It's currently in active development, so it's very likely that this video will be deprecated in a few weeks or a few months, so keep that in mind. To really understand the advantages of this Phoenix LiveView technology, I'm going to need to kind of go back and show you guys what web architecture looks like and how it's evolved over the years. Back in the first days of the web, you would essentially just have a server, and the server would have a bunch of static pages, and those static pages and assets would be served out to a browser. Nowadays, you have a server, the server's connected to a database, and you have an API between the server and a client-side application. And then when the user connects to your server, the client-side application then handles all of the rendering. There's nothing inherently wrong with this model of building an application. In fact, it's a fairly battle-tested way of building applications. But it can become very complex even when you're dealing with pretty simple use cases. The web app structure can be a bit more complicated because there's a general tendency to want to push most of the business logic into the client side of your application. And this is especially true with libraries like React or Vue, where you have accompanying libraries like Redux and caching databases like Redis, and you can go ahead and basically write what was once a server-side application in a client-side and then just use the server to route the user to the appropriate page. So you'd have your database and then the routing server, which would still connect to the client-side application via an API, and then maybe you're feeding data from your database into your cache, and then you have your client-side application. For the database, maybe you're using SQL or maybe you're using no SQL. Then you've got a routing server, maybe it's written in something like Elixir, or maybe it's written in Go, or maybe you went and you wrote it in Node.js using JavaScript. The client-side application, of course, is going to be written in JavaScript, or maybe it's written in a language that transpiles to JavaScript like ClojureScript or Elm. And you have to know all of these technologies if you want to build an application like this. With the Phoenix LiveView, the idea is that rather than pushing the business logic into the client side, we keep the business logic in the server and we push the rendering into the server as well. The browser connects to the server, which then serves out a simple dynamic page. And that dynamic page then tells the browser to open a WebSocket or a Phoenix channel. The server streams out the HTML to the browser as the user is interacting with the page. You can write almost everything in Elixir and still have it render out like you would with something like React or like with Vue. So if we go back to the example application, and this is what we're going to be building here, you can see this is just a simple chat application. I can type in a random name here, and as soon as I started to type in the name, you can see down here, the body field pops up with a little flash that says that it can't be blank. And this is because the WebSocket is just streaming out that, okay, he started to type in the name, and to submit a message, it needs to have a body as well. Now notice as soon as I start to type in here, that flash goes away, and then of course I can click the send button. And also if I go ahead and I close out of the Phoenix application, the page itself, the part with the chat app inside of it, is loading and we can't access it, and that's because the WebSocket was cut off from the server side. So even though the page around it is still here because it's essentially just a static page, because the WebSocket is not connected anymore, we do not have any of this HTML anymore. I can restart the Phoenix server and you can see here I didn't even have to reload the page. Alright, so now that we've explained what LiveView does for us, let's go ahead and build out our application. So we're going to use the Phoenix generator to generate an application. So just type in mix phoenix.new live chat, which will be the name of our application. Once we're finished generating our application, we can cd into the folder and run mix ecto create to create the SQL database, and then we can open up our project in Visual Studio Code. Let's go into our mix.exs file, and then we'll add Phoenix LiveView as a dependency. And as you can see here, we're pointing towards the GitHub repository, and that's because the Phoenix LiveView is not on the hex repository. Now let's go ahead and run mix do deps.get compile, which will go ahead and get the new dependencies and then compile everything. And now we need to set up a few things to make our LiveView dependency work in our project. So first let's go into config.exs, and down here we need to add a line underneath of the pub sub line for our LiveView, and we're going to be putting in a signing salt, which we can generate from our command line. And I'm going to go ahead and do this by typing in mix phoenix.gen.secret, and then I'm going to type in 32, and then this will generate our secret, which we can then just copy and paste into this string. Also inside of this config.exs file, we want to add this line because we want to be able to use the Phoenix LiveView templating engine, config Phoenix template engines, LEEX, which is the file extension for the LiveView templating engine, and then we want to put in Phoenix LiveView engine, which is what will handle that template file type. While we're in our config folder, let's go into the dev.exs file. And we want to add a new pattern so that we can handle the live reloading of our new LiveView files. So I've added this pattern here where it's pointing towards lib LiveView web, which is the name of our application, and then live. And inside of this live folder is where we'll have all of the LiveView logic. Now we're going to be modifying the actual code inside of our application. So first let's go to LiveView chat_web, and then go to the router.ex file. And we want to add a new plug to the router. This plug will be for handling Phoenix LiveView flashes. So we just put in plug Phoenix LiveView flash like this. Then let's go into our livechatweb.ex file. And in here we can add the global dependencies that we want to add to our different components. So for our view component, we need to add some global dependencies. Specifically, we want to import phoenix.liveview, and we want to import two functions, both of them called live render, one of them of argument size 2 and then the other one of argument size 3. This will allow us to render out our live views from the actual view that we create. And then down in the router portion of this file, we want to add import phoenix.liveview.router. We also need to go into our endpoint.ex file to expose the WebSocket that we're going to use to feed the HTML updates to the user's client. And our WebSocket will just be called /live. We just put in socket /live and then Phoenix LiveView socket. To make this WebSocket work properly, we're going to need to modify the assets layer of our application as well. So let's go into our package.json inside of the assets folder and add this dependency here, so Phoenix LiveView. And we just need to point it towards deps Phoenix LiveView. Now we can go inside of the JS folder inside of our assets folder, and inside of our app.js file we can import LiveSocket from our Phoenix LiveView dependency, and we want to instantiate a new LiveSocket on /live and then connect it. So when the user connects to our server, we serve out a very basic piece of HTML. And this is essentially our quote-unquote client-side application. And all that piece of HTML does is connect to the user and then open up the WebSocket. So that's all this JavaScript does for us, and that's all we actually need to do with the JavaScript to make this work. There is one more step that we need to take though for this to work properly, and that is just to go into the assets folder in our command line and then type in npm install to actually wire up the new dependency Also, make sure you don't have a space here between the file colon and the dot dot to the path. Otherwise, this will throw an error when you run npm install and tell you that it can't find the package.json for this particular dependency. And now we're finished setting up Phoenix LiveView. Now, I expect that in the future, when Phoenix LiveView becomes an integral part of the Phoenix framework, that it will be much easier for a user to actually integrate it with their application. Alright, so now let's start to work on our application. And so first let's start by generating a context with a schema that will allow us to store the messages that a user sends in the chat room into our database. So we're going to use the Phoenix Gen context generator, and the context will be called chat, then the schema will be called message, and the actual table will be called messages because we'll have multiple messages. The two fields inside of messages will be content, which will be a string, so we don't have to actually annotate it as a string, and then username, which will also be a string. Now, once we've executed this command, we can go ahead and type in mix-ecto.migrate to migrate it to our database. And now we should have a chat folder inside of the live chat root folder. And inside of chat, we'll have a message.ex file. In here, we have our schema for the messages, where we have the field for content and username. And then we have the change set, which validates these messages. And we're going to leave all of this alone for now. Instead, we're going to go into this chat.ex file, which is inside of the live chat folder. And we're going to be adding a few new functions to this file. Now, first let's start by creating a subscribe function. And for this to work, we want to also create a constant called topic. And all this constant is an inspect call on our module name. And this just returns a string representation of our module name. Then inside of subscribe, we're going to be using our Phoenix pub/sub module calling subscribe, and we're going to be subscribing with livechat.pub/sub and then the topic. So this is the server that we're using, and then the topic is essentially the chat room name. Now at the bottom of our file, let's create some private functions called notify subs, and we're going to be using pattern matching to decide whether or not we should broadcast the message to all of the clients that are connected to our chat room, or whether or not we should throw back an error. So notify subs will be private, and we'll pattern match on the first argument. If the first argument is a tuple of OK and result, then we want to call Phoenix pub/sub broadcast, pass in our server name, which will be livechat pub/sub, pass in the topic, and then we'll pass in a tuple with our module and the event as well as the result. Then we'll return a tuple of OK and result from this function. The second version of this function will pattern match on a tuple of error and reason. And for this function, we're not going to need the event, and we'll just return that tuple of error and reason from the function. Now we can go ahead and modify some of the existing functions in here. So let's modify the create message function. This takes a message map, then it takes the attributes which are being passed into it, puts it into that empty message map, and then inserts it into our database. And after it is inserted into our database, we'll call notify subs, and we'll pass in a list of message and inserted. This way we differentiate between the different CRUD operations that happen on our messages. We'll do the same for the update message function, except this time rather than passing in an atom of inserted, we'll pass in an atom of updated. And finally, we'll do it again for our delete message function, where we just take the message, we delete it from the repository, and then we call notify subs, pass in message, and then an atom of deleted. So the cool thing about adding this logic is that we could add a bunch of stuff to our LiveView templates to make it so that different actions happen depending on what happens to a message. Now that we're finished dealing with our actual model and our data, let's go ahead and create a chat controller So inside of livechat_web, and then inside of controllers, we create a new file called chatcontroller.ex. And then we're going to define this module as livechatweb.chatcontroller. And then we want this to take on the Phoenix controller behavior. So we're going to say use livechatweb, controller. And for this chat controller, we're only going to want to write one single function. This function will be the index function, and all it will really do is take the connection map and then convert it into a WebSocket and pass it along to our LiveView logic. So we're going to call Phoenix LiveView controller and then call live render. And we pass in the connection, which, like I said before, is a map. Then we pass in where we want to handle this connection. And we're going to handle it in a module which we'll create called livechatweb live index. And then we also have this session map. And the session map is pretty cool because if we wanted to add some like metadata, like for instance, say we authenticated a user, we could pass in that user's ID and then use it inside of our live view. So the way you want to really think of this is like we're essentially just taking the connection map and then we're passing the pieces of the map that we want to our socket, and then the WebSocket itself has a map attached to it called its assigns map, and we'll get into that here in a moment. Now while we're at it, let's also create a chat view. So inside of our views folder, we just want to create a chatview.ex file and then just define a module called livechatweb.chatview and then give it the livechatweb view behavior. Now inside of our router, we can come down here to where we have this get page controller and just change the page controller into our chat controller. And now when we go to the index of our application, it will execute the index function inside of our chat controller, and then that will send us over to our live view stuff. Now speaking of our live view logic, let's go ahead and create a live folder, and then we're going to create a file in here called index.ex. Inside of this file is going to be our livechatweb.live.index module. We're going to want to bring in the live view behavior. So use phoenix.liveview. And then we want to alias our chat file and then our message file. Now each live view starts out with a mount function. So the mount function takes in the session and it takes in a socket, and then we tell it what we want to do with that socket when the live view is initially connected. Now for our function, we're not going to need this session immediately, but we are going to want to manipulate the socket. If we're connected to the socket, then execute our chat subscribe function and then return a tuple of OK and then fetch socket, and fetch is a function which we'll create here in a moment. The live view behavior also is going to need a render function, and the render function takes in the socket's assigns map and then we tell it how we want it to manipulate this assigns map. So what we're going to do with render is just take our assigns, then call livechatweb chatview, which is the view that we created a moment ago, and then call the render function to render a file called index.html, which will be our live view template, and then we just want to pass our assigns map into it. Now let's go ahead and create this fetch function. So the fetch function is just going to take the socket and it'll take a username if there is one, and if not, it'll be nil. And what we're going to do is just take and attach various pieces of metadata to this socket's assigns map. So to add the map to our socket, we can use a function called assign. We pass in the socket as the first argument to this function, and then we pass in a map of the keys and values that we want to assign to the socket. We want to assign the username to a username key, then we'll assign our messages to a messages key, and we get the messages just by calling chat.listMessages. And then we also want to have a key called changeSet, and for this we'll just call chat.changeMessage and then pass in a message map with the username inside of it. Also, let's go ahead and create a simple helper function which will allow us to take this socket and grab the username from the assigns map. So we just call socket.assigns and then pipe that into map.get, and we pass in the username Adam. Let's go ahead and create the templates. So inside of our templates folder, we'll create a folder called chat, and then we'll create an index.html.leex file. And then we'll also create a form.html.leex file. These will be our LiveView templates. And as you can see, the LiveView templating engine uses the extension .leex rather than .eex like a normal template. We're going to use that form as a partial, and we'll render the form inside of our index.html file. So at the top of our index, we have an unordered list, and then we'll have logic to display the messages inside of this unordered list. And then at the bottom here, we'll render out our form by calling render form.html and then passing in our assigns map. All of our normal Elixir templating rules apply here. So I'm going to use a for loop, so just for messages inside of our @messages. Then we want to create list elements where we take the message username, wrap it inside of strong, so we bold it, and then we follow it with our message content. Then once we're finished, we just have our little end block. Now let's create our form. So we're going to use some embedded Elixir here. We're going to say f equals form4, pass in our @change set, then pass in a £. Then we're going to set up a bunch of different atoms. So we're going to add a Phoenix change. This is all of the events that happen on change. We're going to call this atom here called validate, and we'll have a function inside of our index file which will correspond with this validate atom. Then for Phoenix submit, meaning submitting the form, we're going to call this atom here called send message. And then we also want auto completion to be turned off for this form. And then we have our closing form tag here. Now let's set up the username. So we want to have a label for the username, and we need to put in our form. So label F, username, then text input, which is the actual input box, and we're going to put in F again for the username, and then an error tag at the bottom, and we'll put in F again, and then we'll put in username. And we'll repeat this process for our content. So we'll have a label, a text input, and then an error tag for the content field. And then finally, we want to create our submission button. And we can do this by first wrapping it in a div, and then using embedded Elixir, using the submit function to create the button, passing in the string that we want to have on the button, which will be send. And then we want to set up a Phoenix disable with atom. And what this will do is it will basically put the text that follows it, this loading string, on the button if the button is disabled. So if we send a message and it takes a little while for it to send, then the loading button will pop up and the user won't be able to click on the button. And that's all we have to do for these two templates. So let's now wire them to our index file. Now LiveView itself is a bit like a glorified gen server. So we've got our mount and render functions, which are mandatory. And I've also put this fetch function in here so that we can change the map that's associated with the socket. And because we have all of these live events which are coming through our LiveView templates, we need to add some handle events and some handle info functions. The first handle event function will deal with the validate event. We'll take in a map with the messages and we'll destruct it into params so that we can access the stuff inside of it. And then we'll also pass in the socket. And when we're validating our form, all we really want to do is take the real-time input that the user's pushing into the form boxes and pass them through this little pipeline. So we'll take an empty message map, pass it through chat change message with the parameters, which are our real-time parameters. and then we'll put them inside of a map using action insert. And then we'll take this change set and we'll assign it to our socket assigns map through the change set key that we created up here. The handle event function is asynchronous, so the return will be a tuple of no reply followed by our assigned socket change set. Now let's handle the send message event. We'll pass in a string of send message, and then we'll destruct our map so that we can get the params from the form, and of course we need to pass in the socket. We'll do some pattern matching on chat.createMessage with the params, and this will essentially just go through the change set and then validate the message using our ecto stuff. So all of the stuff that was generated for our message data type here will apply to our form. So if we get back OK and message from calling this function here, if we get back OK and message from calling chat create message with our params inside of it, then we'll pass back a tuple of no reply, and then we'll call fetch on the socket, and we'll pass in our message.username. If we get back an error and an empty ecto change set, then we'll just pass back no reply, and then we'll call assign on socket, and we'll set the change set equal to our empty change set. Now to finish off our logic here, we're also going to need to create a handle info function. The handle info function is a function that we would use more of. We would actually create more of these if we wanted to handle the various different event types. For instance, if we wanted to make it so that a user could edit a message or delete a message, we would add more handle infos here. So all we're really doing is just handling any generic event, and what we're going to do is just pass in a tuple with chat and then a list with message and then the event type followed by the message itself and then the socket, and then we're just going to pass back no reply, call fetch on the socket, and then we're going to call get username on the socket. This way we are always putting the username into the socket map. So as the user is just typing on their keyboard, the username is constantly being updated inside of the WebSocket. And that's all of the logic that we're going to need for our application. So let's go ahead and run the application with mixphoenix.server. And we can now open up the application inside of localhost 4000. And here is our application. And as you can see here, I can start to type in these boxes and I can click send. And now we have a message that appears at the top here. Now notice, of course, that the chat box isn't styled like it was in the beginning of this video. And we also have the Phoenix framework boilerplate at the top. So let's go ahead and get rid of all that and add some styling to our chat box. So to get rid of all of the boilerplate, let's just come in here and grab all of this header stuff and remove it. And now you can see the Phoenix image has disappeared from our application. And if we go back into our index.html.leex file, we can go ahead and add a style key for our unordered list so that the unordered list will actually look like a box rather than just a list. First, let's start by getting rid of the list style. So we'll pass in list style none. Then we'll give it a min height of 400 pixels. Then we'll give it a simple border, so just border 1 pixel solid, and then some padding. And I'm just going to give it 10 pixels of padding. And now if we just go back to our browser, you can see that the actual page updates and it looks more like a chat room. And of course we can open up multiple windows for our chat, and then this will simulate having multiple different clients connected to the chat room. So on the right side I have the name Tensor, and then on the left side I'm just going to call the user test, and then we can just type in random messages here. And as you can see, it comes through in real time. Alright guys, well I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below. And if you dislike this video, then by all means downvote it as much as you like. Have a good night.